I will make a presentation about my perspective, epistemology different world perspective. The title of my presentation is The World versus Epistemologically Different Worlds. This presentation is about my epistemological different worlds for recalling the unbelievable similarities between my works from different years and Marcus Gabriel's works, his book and his TED clip from 2013. I start my presentation now. I will talk the first part about philosophy and science. Once upon a time, the great scientist was a philosopher. The great philosopher was a scientist. Several centuries ago, a philosopher who was a scientist also tried to offer a Weltanschauung. This is the only word, German word that I use today. A Weltanschauung, an image of the world. This was the job for philosophers in the past. In the last 100 years, the scientific knowledge increases enormously. A huge amount of scientific knowledge offered by special sciences like physics, biology, cognitive science. These special sciences, particular sciences, try to explain all phenomena. They try to explain the world. Each science is specialized on a particular aspect of the world, and each science have different theories that explain various phenomena. Under these circumstances, philosophers abandon fight for Weltanschauung and retire with a solemn dignity under the logical linguistic wrappers of analyzing the linguistic notions, and later running in moral and political mind-blowing debates. However, this powerlessness was reflected by the attitude of majority of philosophers in rejecting even the temptation in creating Weltanschauung. Devastated by such enormous knowledge from sciences, particular sciences, philosophers was captured by sterile dispute on profound topics. The philosophers of the last century remained unsettled in front of decisive steps ahead taken by the great scientists. Now, in our days, old philosophical questions belong to science. In fact, are the scientists who try to answer to such philosophical questions. Reading the book written by Hawking and another person, you can find this slogan in his book, 2010, Philosophy is Dead. I just emphasize a paradox. In our days, the number of philosophers is much larger than in the past. So it's a huge paradox. The philosophy is dead, but instead there are so many philosophers in our days. Science. Let's move to talk about a little bit about science. There are four main problems in science that try to explain the world. There are four dualities. Mind, body, or brain, that belongs to cognitive science. Cell, organism, or life. Cell or organism on one side, the other side is life, belong to biology. Particle waves, quantum mechanics in physics, and the relationship between micro and macro phenomena that reflects the relationship between Einstein and quantum mechanics in physics also. All the other great problems in special sciences are under this umbrella created by these main four problems. From my view, I believe that these problems are pseudo problems. And this is the reason that in 100 years nobody could solve these problems. The framework that is wrong is the world, or as I call it, the unicorn world. The great philosophers has to deal with this framework in order to the scientists to solve this problem, or to show that they are not possible to be solved because of pseudo problems. So, if a philosopher has to deal, for a philosopher is to manage with such frameworks, I introduce now epistemology different worlds. World, so unicorn world, is in fact it does not, the world does not exist. It is a human creation, a human illusion. It is the oldest Ptolemaic epicycle, the most powerful, and nobody asked about the world in the last 2,500 years. Scientists work and think in this framework all the time. The unicorn world created those four dualities that are in fact pseudo-problems in science. So, In order to avoid these pseudosciences, the pseudo-problems, we have to replace the world with epistemologically different worlds. The principles of epistemologically different worlds that I will present here, there are some principles applied for some particular cases. In my books you can find the universal principles, but here are just for particular cases. I present this because in such short time it would be too difficult for me to present the general principles. So I took some particular principles. The first 4 principles, I have 11 principles. The 5 are about non-living entities. Epistemologically different interactions constitute epistemologically different entities, and epistemologically different entities determine epistemologically different interactions. Second, any entity exists only at the surface because of interaction that constitute. Number 3, any entity exists in a single epistemological world and interacts only with a non-living entity from the same epistemological world. Any epistemological world appears from and disappears in the hyper-nothing. I will not talk about hyper-nothing, I don't have time to talk about, but you can find in my book from 2011. The last principle, any epistemological world is, therefore, all epistemological worlds have the same objective reality. Few words about these principles. The unicorn world, the world means for us, until now, all entities or objects exist in the same spatial temporal framework, and this is wrong. We have to replace unicorn world, or the world, or the universe, with epistemological worlds. All objects exist, but not in the same world, but in epistemologically different worlds. Such epistemologically different worlds are completely different than parallel worlds or universe. These notions are used in quantum mechanics. You can find, I talk particularly about this topic in the book from 2010. The distinction between epistemology and ontology is completely wrong. This distinction dominated philosophy since Plato until our days. So it's completely wrong. And I want to emphasize the first principle: to interact means to exist. The interactions between two entities determine the existence of those objects. And those two objects determine epistemological interaction, and the interactions constitute epistemological different entities. This is the main principle. Exist is for an entity with determinations or features. In general, the objects or entities are in a spatial temporal framework, but this is just in general. There are cases in which an entity or an epistemological world is not in a spatial temporal framework. I can give some example. Photons. For photons doesn't exist time. For mind doesn't exist space. Existence and interaction are strongly interrelated, what I said before this. Interaction constitutes the surface of a need. Ontological reality is just at the surface. We cannot talk about the internal existence of an object. An object exists just at the surface. Constitution is strongly related to determination, and the parts whole, in order to explain relationship, these philosophical questions, relationship parts whole, we have to introduce an organizational and epistemological ontological threshold. I do not have time to talk about this, you can find in my books. Quantum gravity is an illicit extension. Graviton is impossible to be used, so in fact graviton it's impossible to exist. You can find this in my books, it's Karma rule. Space, time and the Big Bang. Space, time and entities. I accept Leibniz's view about space and time, and not Newtonian view with absolute and space and time. The space and time are just dependent on the entities that belongs to one or other epistemological world. Another feature of an epistemological world is that as a whole, we cannot perceive an epistemological world as a whole. We cannot extend space and time to all epistemological worlds. And what I said, photons and mind do not have space and respectively time. Before Big Bang, What was before Big Bang from my viewpoint? It was another epistemological world, and maybe before that one was another epistemological world, but in order to avoid the regress ad infinitum, the beginning was one epistemological world with no space and time. Maybe that epistemological world exists. I emphasize that there is no causality between one epistemological world and the other. One epistemological world does not exist for any other epistemological world. So there is no relation of causality. Causality and relationship between mind and brain, or table and microparticles. What is the causality between mind and brain, or table and microparticles? Meaningless questions. Even the identity theory is wrong in such cases. Mind is not identical with the brain. Table is not identical with the microparticle. Table and microparticles belong to epistemologically different worlds. The table belongs to macro-epistemological world, and the microparticles belongs to epistemological, micro-epistemological world. We have to exclude the existence of God, otherwise we have to go to the church. If we exclude the existence of God, we have to accept either the perspective of nobody, but this is a meaningless position, or the perspective of each entity that belongs to a particular class of entity that represent, in fact, epistemological different worlds. So we replace the unicorn world with epistemological different worlds. I introduce now proposition for being. I mean the subjectivity, human subjectivity, life, mind, and so the propositions are for being and self and organism, because the cell has a life, the organism has a life. So what is the relationship between the cell and the life, respectively organism and the life? I introduce another 5 principles. Life or mind corresponds to a cell or an organism. It's not identical with a cell or an organism, but just corresponds, because life, we move to the next principle, life or mind is an epistemological word. Therefore, life is, or mind is, it is undetermined. Having certain determination, from our viewpoint, a cell is composed of an amalgam of molecules and cells and their relationship. Certain states and processes form knowledge that is life or mind. And an entity having a unity, life and mind, is an indeterminate individuality. I don't believe somebody who can explain me the limits of her or his life. I don't believe somebody, look, I can see the limits of my life, or I can see the limits of my mind. This is the reason that I introduced the last principle. There is a mind, or the life is an epistemological word, but it's indeterminate individuality. We can determine, we can perceive the feature of this object in front of us, but we cannot perceive the feature of our life. Life has no feature. Like the mind, we can perceive some feature, some mental states, but it's not perception. It's just certain mental states and processes for knowledge that is life or mind. So any mental state is the mind, is not part of the mind. I avoid certain contradiction with these notions. The problem is that any epistemological world is an indeterminate individuality. Without correspondence between life, mind, respectively, and cell organism, there is no organism surviving in its environment. So we need this correspondence between life and cell, for instance, or between mind and organism, in order the organism to survive in environment. But pay attention, there is no relationship between epistemological different worlds. So there is no causality between mind or organism. The mind doesn't emerge. The mind is not identical with the organism. Mind is an epistemological world, and the organism belongs to an epistemologically different world. Coordination of biological functions needs a unity impossible to be used within mechanism of a cell and organism. So this is the relation. This is the reason.